As you've heard, drug kingpin Ismael Zambada García, also known as El Mayo, has confessed to a lifetime of crime in service to the Sinaloa Cartel,
the largest drug trafficking organization in the world.
For decades, the Sinaloa Cartel, under El Mayo's leadership, made billions of dollars.
This is an historic day.
El Mayo operated with impunity at the highest levels of the Mexican drug trafficking world,
including leading a sprawling criminal enterprise that distributed more than 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine in addition to other drugs.
His partner was El Chapo. They were co-founders of the Sinaloa Cartel. He controlled corrupt officials and officers who protected his workers and his drug shipments. They used military-grade weapons and directed hitmen to kill their adversaries. They committed gruesome assassinations, kidnappings, and horrible crimes to maintain discipline within their own organization.
In the summer of 2024, a new war broke out after the capture of El Mayo, causing the cartel to fracture after a major betrayal. This time, it's El Mayo's heirs opposing those of El Chapo, each mobilizing their respective networks and alliances in the conflict. Two rival factions emerge, nicknamed Mayiza and Chapiza, or more simply, the Mayos versus the Chapitos. From that moment on, Sinaloa, and especially its capital Culiacán, a city of around 1 million inhabitants, becomes a true war zone. This conflict claims the lives of nearly 2,000 people in less than a year, while more than 5 people are kidnapped each day. The Mexican army deploys reinforcements from across the country in an effort to regain control of Culiacán and other cities affected by the fighting. Since the start of this offensive, the city has become a lawless zone, where no one dares to go out at night for fear of being targeted, effectively creating a curfew. Even with authorities present on the ground, nothing seems able to curb the violence.
Porque la guerra siempre fue entre Chapos y Mayo. Fue entre gente con gente nomás, no con los familiares. Ustedes nos levantan un primo, un hermano, cualquier familiar de un trabajador aquí en la Mayiza, y la vamos a levantar 20.
Both factions have no shortage of recruits ready to join their ranks. The financial stakes are too high, and the conflict has already crossed a point of no return.
We were sometimes told we were chasing shadows, legends of men who believed they were untouchable. One of those men was El Mayo.
El Mayo will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will die in a U.S. federal prison where he belongs.
After building his empire for more than 4 decades, El Mayo undeniably became Mexico's shadow godfather. With a fortune estimated at several tens of billions of dollars, he's already faced this type of violence, similar to what now ravages Sinaloa. Through his lawyer, he sends a message calling for a ceasefire. Nothing is gained by bloodshed. It only deepens wounds and prolongs suffering. Despite this call for calm, El Mayo's words are unlikely to be enough to halt the bloodshed. The situation is already out of control. While the heirs of the two dynasties fight each other, other cartels are taking advantage of this unique opportunity. Sensing the weakness of the rival factions, they're either attempting to seize Sinaloa territories directly or forge strategic alliances with one of the sides. The stakes are enormous. Sinaloa represents the epicenter of Mexican drug trafficking. This strategic region is home not only to the main production areas, but also the crucial infrastructure for processing and transporting drugs to the U.S. market. Whoever controls Sinaloa controls the market. The conflict now has spread beyond Sinaloa's borders. Groups affiliated with both sides are reorganizing across Mexico. each seeking to consolidate its position.
Sinaloa Cartel may think that they're powerful and mighty, but rest assured, we are all up here because we have one goal in mind, and that is the destruction of the Sinaloa Cartel.
Despite the arrest of its most emblematic leaders, the Sinaloa Cartel remains the most powerful network in the American continent.
The organization I led promoted corruption in my home country by paying police officers, military commanders, and politicians who allowed us to operate freely. It goes back to the very beginning when I was a young man starting out, and it continued for all those years.
To understand how El Mayo, El Chapo, and their associates built this empire, which operates in at least 40 countries as of 2025, we need to go back to its origins. Sinaloa is not just a Mexican state. It's the cradle of the country's most powerful drug lords. Amado, the fearsome leader of the Juarez cartel, was born in Sinaloa. Benjamin, who led the Tijuana cartel, also originated from there. Even the famous Guadalajara Cartel, despite its name, was almost entirely led by men from Sinaloa. This unique region, wedged between the Pacific Ocean and the impressive mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental, plays the same role for Mexican trafficking as Sicily does for the Italian mafia. It is here that future kingpins take their first steps. The deeper you go into these mountains, the more you enter a true no man's land, a gray area perfectly suited to become the heart of a drug empire. In this forgotten territory, far from prying eyes, trafficking is not just a business, it's a way of life. It all begins with the poppy. This small, seemingly innocent flower hid a treasure that the Sinaloans quickly learned to exploit: opium, which once processed becomes the highly coveted heroin in the United States. But these men had a particular talent: adapting to the demands of the market. When demand for weed surged in the 1960s among their American neighbors, they quickly changed course. Thousands of farmers were recruited for cultivation, and plantations expanded from the mountains of Sinaloa into the neighboring territories of Chihuahua and Durango. This region became so important that it earned a nickname that has now become part of legend: the Golden Triangle.
The Golden Triangle is a difficult-to-access mountainous region straddling the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango in northern Mexico.
The Golden Triangle is not just a simple territory. It's a natural fortress that defies any authority. For decades, these mountains have served as a refuge and operational base for numerous Mexican drug lords. Isolated from major cities, this region is practically cut off from the outside world. The Mexican state is almost invisible there. To grasp its vastness, imagine a territory twice the size of the Netherlands, or 3 times the size of New Jersey, covering more than 23,000 square miles. According to a high-ranking Mexican official, even with a considerable army, it would be practically impossible to locate someone hiding in these mountains. When you walk through these mountain villages, the reality is glaring. These communities live in complete neglect. The state is absent. Only sturdy 4x4s can reach them, climbing for hours along rough dirt roads. In this near-total isolation, a parallel economy has naturally developed. With so few opportunities, what choice is there? People survive as best they can. For most families living below the poverty line, the drug trade is not a choice. It's their only means of survival. In the local mindset, narcos are not seen as criminals, but as protectors, those who create jobs where the state has failed. The economic disparity is striking. A few weeks of work for the Sinaloa bosses during the rainy season earns as much as a whole year of traditional farming. In this parallel economy, the Sinaloa kingpins offer something no one else does. They buy every harvest without exception. It's a level of security that farmers cannot find anywhere else. That's why 70% of Mexico's cannabis is grown in these 3 states. Children don't aspire to become lawyers or doctors, but narcos. It's the only model of success they see around them.
90% of the criminal organizations come from Sinaloa, the cradle of the biggest traffickers Mexico has ever known. That is where they are trained every day. A 15 or 16-year-old boy in Sinaloa is already a killer, a gunman, a man. That is why they execute a 15-year-old. For them, it is a crime against a man. It's the culture.
At that time, the business operated in a rudimentary but effective manner. Farmers grew crops in the mountains, and smugglers transported the goods to the United States. Simple and straightforward. The echoes of the quick fortunes generated by this business resonated across Mexico, drawing the attention of ambitious criminals. But among all these contenders, only one would truly revolutionize the trade. His name? Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, nicknamed El Padrino, the Godfather. In the early 1970s, this former police officer was barely 25 years old when he began to go down the wrong path. Gifted with formidable intelligence and a keen political sense, he would soon become the first undisputed leader of Mexico's Narcos. To understand what comes next, it's important to know that at this time, Mexico was not yet structured into cartels as we know them today. The groups were simpler. They were simply called cliques or gangs. Most importantly, they had not yet divided the country into exclusive territories as if they were splitting a cake. The most surprising part of this story is the secret pact that bound these gangs to the Mexican government. Imagine a system where every gram of drugs moved with the tacit blessing of the authorities. Nothing, absolutely nothing, crossed the border without their approval. On the ground, this system ran like a well-oiled machine. The army looked the other way at just the right moment. The police discreetly escorted convoys. And at the top of this pyramid of corruption stood the Federal Security Directorate, the DFS, Mexico's equivalent of the CIA, pulling the strings from the shadows. A former DFS agent reveals how the system worked. It wasn't ordinary corruption, but a true, unofficial tax. The rules were simple, yet strict. Smugglers paid $60 per kilo transported, and in exchange they received protection and freedom of action. This money was then redistributed among the various branches of the state: police, army, politicians. This system was based on a fundamental principle: all drugs had to leave Mexico. Local consumption was forbidden. Everything had to go to the American neighbors, as they delicately put it. In this parallel world, the Mexican state was not a victim of traffickers. It was their silent partner, and even their boss. The barons who followed the rules prospered. Those who refused to pay had their merchandise seized and ended up behind bars. This well-oiled mechanism operated without excessive violence, in near total silence. Meanwhile, in the United States, the streets were awash with a constant flow of Mexican drugs. It was impossible for Washington to turn a blind eye any longer. Under pressure from the DEA, the Mexican government launched an operation in 1975, codenamed Operation Condor. This operation, funded and backed by the United States, but carried out by the Mexican military, officially aimed to eradicate the poppy and marijuana crops thriving in the notorious Golden Triangle. The United States invested heavily in this collaboration. Modern helicopters, surveillance equipment, and specialized training for Mexican soldiers. An impressive show of force. But behind the scenes, the reality was quite different. This spectacular deployment was merely a show. Operation Condor devastated the plantations but failed to neutralize the kingpins. Thanks to the corruption that had penetrated the Mexican federal agency, the DFS, the major barons were tipped off in advance. Like birds fleeing a storm, they abandoned their lands in Sinaloa and moved to other territories. Miguel, already nicknamed the Godfather by everyone, chose to settle in Guadalajara, in the neighboring state of Jalisco. This forced relocation, far from weakening his group, would paradoxically make it stronger. The operation intended to destroy the business had merely shifted the problem, giving Miguel the opportunity to reorganize his operation. The Mexican underworld was not at its twilight, but at its dawn. Its greatest years were still ahead. For several years, the hills remained hard to access, but business quickly resumed with new plantations. Miguel, however, was preoccupied with a more fundamental problem. Until then, the production and distribution of drugs had been scattered among several small local gangs. These leaders operated in different regions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes fighting over territory. Miguel realized something that no one had seen before him. Rather than fighting over territories, why not unite? Where others saw only rivalries, Miguel envisioned a federation with himself as CEO. And so, at the end of the 1970s, an organization was born that would redefine Mexican history: the Guadalajara Cartel. This strategic alliance allowed the cartel to greatly expand its production for the American market, all with the complicity of the DFS, which regularly received briefcases stuffed with cash. Thanks to his political connections and strategic alliances, Miguel reigns at the top of the empire he built. At his side are his loyal allies, Ernesto Don Neto and Rafael Rafa Caro Quintero. Contrary to what media might suggest, the cartel wasn't led solely by these three men. The structure was far more complex, resembling a confederation rather than a traditional hierarchical pyramid. Apart from Miguel, undeniably at the top, the organization functioned as an alliance of regional leaders, each controlling their own territory and men. Within this fluid structure, three main levels can be distinguished, of which we'll only mention the characters who would forever mark history, even though the list is much longer. At the top were the true leaders, Miguel of course, but also Don Neto, Pablo Acosta, and El Azul, among others. These men made the major decisions and controlled the main routes. A level below operated trusted men like Amado and, ironically, Rafa, who, despite his media notoriety, wasn't as powerful as that. And at the bottom of the ladder, almost invisible at the time, were Héctor Palma, El Chapo, the Beltran-Leyva brothers led by Arturo, and the Arellano Felix brothers. At that time, they were merely foot soldiers, growers, or low-level operators within the organization. Although nearly all members were from the state of Sinaloa, it was the city of Guadalajara that lent its name to the cartel. This was no coincidence. The metropolis, far from the heavily monitored border regions, had become their headquarters. It's here that several crucial negotiations would take place, particularly the one concerning the arrival of coke that would turn simple Mexican smugglers into multimillionaires. At the time, it was well known that Colombians held a monopoly over every stage of trafficking this product, generating billions of dollars. Their empire spanned the entire logistics chain, from production at the source to strategic transport, and finally to distribution on the streets of the United States through their partners. The Colombians had a well-oiled system. They transported their coke from South America directly to Florida, either by plane or by boat through the Caribbean. Once on American soil, the product was distributed in the major cities of the East Coast, with New York as the primary market. This route was their perfectly oiled drug highway. But when they tried to conquer the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Diego, and all of California, they ran into a major problem. The distance was too great and the surveillance too intense. This is where an alliance was born that would eventually sideline the Colombians. They proposed a partnership with Mexican organizations specializing in weed trafficking, particularly the one led by Miguel. The Colombians needed a local partner who knew the border crossings like the back of his hand. The deal was strikingly simple. The Colombians delivered their precious cargo to the Mexicans, who then handled the riskiest part, crossing the U.S. border. Once the product was in California, the Colombian cartel members resumed control for final distribution in the streets of Los Angeles and San Diego. The payment system was straightforward. Each kilo of white powder that crossed the border earned the Mexican smugglers a cash commission. At first, it was just a trickle, a few modest shipments using this new route. After all, the East Coast remained the Colombians' main market. In fact, at that time, only 20% of all coke sold in the United States passed through Mexico. But that small 20% was already significant enough to grant the Mexican smugglers considerably more power.
The power of corruption grew decisively. The organizations themselves became far stronger. They grew much richer, much more powerful, and with far greater control. It was no longer 1 million, 2 million. It was 15 million, 20 million, 30 million, or 40 million that they could make from a single shipment. And this gives them enormous purchasing power.
This power was openly displayed on the streets of Guadalajara. Real estate investments were booming, with luxurious hotels and lavish villas appearing everywhere. Business flourished spectacularly, turning the city into a true paradise for narcos. Everyone had their place here, enjoying space and protection. Yet tensions occasionally arose, particularly around Amado. Despite his outward discretion, no one could have predicted that this young man, barely 25, would become a decade later the legendary Lord of the Skies, surpassing all his rivals and mentors. His power would grow to such an extent that even Miguel, the great godfather, would appear amateurish in comparison. At this time, however, he still held a subordinate position within the hierarchy. Amado's story begins in the desert lands of Sinaloa, under the protective wing of his uncle, Don Neto. In 1981, like many other ambitious young Sinaloans, he moved to Guadalajara to join Miguel's thriving organization. But fate had other plans for him. A minor dispute arose between Amado and Rafa, another protege of Don Neto. At the heart of this conflict was a young woman from one of Guadalajara's most influential families. While Rafa courted her openly, the young woman also showed interest in Amado whenever the opportunity arose. Faced with this risky situation, Don Neto had to make a decision. Having always favored Rafa, he chose to keep him by his side in Guadalajara and send his own nephew Amado to the other end of the country, to the northern border in the state of Chihuahua, to work under Pablo Acosta. Unknowingly, as we will later see, Don Neto actually did Amado a great service with this decision. Let's take a look at northern Mexico. Imagine a border stretching nearly 2,000 miles, winding through deserts and rivers, dotted with more than 40 official crossing points, strategic gateways through which cars and trucks pass every day. For the cartels, this border was not an obstacle, but an opportunity. Each crossing point represented a potential route to the most lucrative market in the world, the United States. The main crossing points controlled by the Guadalajara group were strategically positioned near border cities like Tijuana, Nogales, and Juarez. In the eastern part of the country, key points such as Matamoros remained under the exclusive control of the Gulf Cartel. Mexican territory was then clearly divided into two zones of influence. The Pacific coast was controlled by Guadalajara, while the eastern coast was dominated by the Gulf Cartel. This separation allowed for a relatively peaceful coexistence between the two notorious organizations. As for Amado, he's sent to Ojinaga, a small border town across from Texas, separated from the United States by a simple bridge. Although less strategic than Juarez, this town becomes his true training ground under Pablo Acosta's tutelage. Pablo takes the young man under his wing to teach him all the secrets of the trade, unaware that the student would soon surpass the master. Amado's true strength lies in his social intelligence. Pablo, an old-school smuggler, had built his business primarily on cannabis, but the era of coke was changing the game. While Pablo maintained a tense relationship with the Colombians whom he viewed with suspicion, Amado demonstrated a natural talent for strategic diplomacy. His social intelligence became his greatest asset. Where Pablo saw adversaries, Amado cultivated partners. His ability to establish strong relationships with the Colombians quickly allowed their operation to move increasingly ever larger quantities of white powder to the American market. However, in Guadalajara, the calm before the storm was coming to an end. The empire that seemed untouchable became threatened when the DEA started to take a close interest in the cartel's operations. The breaking point came in November 1984, when a spectacular operation was launched near the mythical Golden Triangle. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers, guided by American intelligence, suddenly raided Buffalo, a colossal ranch run by Rafa. What they discovered there defied imagination. Weed plantations as far as the eye could see, stretching for miles. Operation Buffalo struck, resulting in the destruction of 8,000 tons of herb. the largest seizure in history at the time, nicknamed the seizure of the century. Imagine these vast fields where thousands of people work daily, stretching over the equivalent of 1,000 American football fields, going up in smoke overnight. This operation could never have taken place without the meticulous work of Kiki Camarena, an undercover DEA agent who, with the help of a pilot, managed to photograph the entire complex from the air. These photos provided such damning evidence that even the corrupt Mexican authorities could not ignore the scale of the operation. Faced with this devastating loss, Rafa and the Guadalajara organization could not remain idle. In February 1985, they orchestrated a brutal revenge. The pilot who flew over El Búfalo and DEA agent Kiki Camarena were kidnapped in broad daylight, coldly tortured, and then executed. This event marked the beginning of the end for the Guadalajara organization. Under intense American pressure, the Mexican government was forced to act. An international manhunt was launched, resulting in the arrest of the main perpetrators. Rafa was captured in Costa Rica, and Don Neto was taken shortly after. Both men were sentenced to long prison terms. The investigation highlighted the unprecedented scale of corruption within the DFS, the same Mexican intelligence agency that actively protected the cartel and took its cut, as mentioned earlier. The scandal reached such proportions that the government had no choice but to completely dissolve the institution, swept up in the storm it had helped to create. Despite this setback, the organization quickly reorganized and maintained its activities. El Azul, a key advisor to the group, was temporarily imprisoned. As for Miguel, although wanted by the DEA, he continued to live openly and flamboyantly in Guadalajara, where he had the entire city in his pocket. In Ojinaga, a Mexican border town, Amado contemplates his situation with a subtle smile. His uncle Don Neto's decision to send him away from Guadalajara several years earlier now proves to be a blessing in disguise. While Don Neto and Rafa sink into the media storm that precipitated their downfall, he remained in the shadows, patiently learning the ins and outs of the business away from the spotlight. However, Pablo Acosta, the mentor who played a crucial role in Amado's rise within the organization, will meet a tragic fate. Do you see the man in this photo? This is Calderoni, one of the most powerful commanders of the Mexican Federal Police. Officially tasked with hunting down members of the Guadalajara Cartel, he was in reality one of the most corrupt officers in the country. Like a modern mercenary, he didn't hesitate to protect certain criminals while pursuing others, his loyalty always going to the highest bidder. In early 1987, Calderoni, with support from American authorities, launches an operation against Pablo Acosta in a small village near Ojinaga. True to his reputation, Pablo refuses to surrender. The confrontation that follows proves fatal for him. Pablo Acosta's elimination is the subject of much speculation in the underworld. Some, including journalist Anabel Hernandez, claim that Amado paid Calderoni $1 million to have his mentor liquidated. DEA reports, cited in Texas Monthly, point in the same direction. Others believe Amado had nothing to do with the operation against Pablo. According to this version, he simply managed to evade the authorities, and it wouldn't be the first time luck was on his side. After Pablo's disappearance, Amado quickly consolidates his grip on various regions of the Chihuahua state. His sights, however, are set on a more ambitious goal to the north, Ciudad Juarez, the most strategic border city in the area, then under the control of Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, a former DFS agent with whom he will soon share the territory. But before that, Amado takes a decisive step in his logistics strategy. He temporarily settles in Torreon to establish a full-fledged airline company. Under the cover of a legal business, he builds an impressive fleet of planes dedicated to large-scale coke transport. This bold move truly marks the beginning of his reign as the future Lord of the Skies. This initiative comes at a crucial moment. Until then, the Colombians have favored the Caribbean route to ship their merchandise to Florida. Mexico was only a secondary passage, used mainly to reach the western United States. But by the late 1980s, everything changes. the U.S. military steps up its surveillance of Caribbean routes, multiplying seizures. Faced with this blockade, the Colombians have no choice. They opt to go through Mexico, whether their final destination is east or west. This new dependence completely upends the balance of power. The Mexican organizations, now indispensable, set their own terms. Instead of merely being paid for their services, they demand a cut of the merchandise. At first, 30% of the load, then as much as 50%. 1 kilo for the Colombians, 1 kilo for the Mexicans. The financial impact is massive. This dynamic with the Colombians radically transforms the ecosystem within Miguel's organization. Second-tier lieutenants, once mere henchmen, gradually develop their own networks and infrastructure with the clear ambition to break free. Among these ambitious figures aspiring to forge their own legend, Joaquín Guzmán Loera, the man who would later become the infamous El Chapo, stands out in particular. Unlike Amado, El Chapo started from nothing. Nicknamed Shorty due to his modest height, about 5 feet 5 inches, he comes from a very poor family. His path strongly contrasts with that of Amado, an imposing, charismatic, and well-built man who from the start had a predetermined future in the business thanks to his family connections. El Chapo, on the other hand, was originally just a simple peasant without resources or connections. Born on a ranch in the municipality of Badiraguato in Sinaloa, El Chapo comes from the very heart of the Golden Triangle, a region infamous as the epicenter of drug production in Mexico. His destiny, like that of many children from this region, seemed predetermined from birth. In these mountains, boys are initiated into trafficking at a very young age, often as young as 6 or 7. During the school year, parents regularly remove them from school to take them to work in the plantations for weeks at a time. Upon their return to class, these children fall far behind. Then, a few months later, the cycle begins again. Most, like El Chapo, find themselves trapped in a vicious circle, repeating the same grades year after year until frustration takes over. They eventually abandon schooling to devote themselves to the only trade they truly know: drug cultivation. Accompanying his father to neighboring villages to sell crops, El Chapo watched how money was spent in the cantinas on alternating alcohol and women. Fascinated by these privileges, though fleeting, he quickly realizes his own future will inevitably follow the same path. He would be supported by his distant cousins, also from Badiraguato, the Beltran-Leyva brothers, led by Arturo, nicknamed El Barbas. Remember him, as he will remain a key figure in this saga for a long time. Tall and slender, El Barbas sported a distinctive beard and, in his elegant suits, could easily blend in with respectable businessmen. Back to El Chapo. He started at the bottom of Miguel's organization but quickly climbed the ranks thanks to his innovative ideas. Working closely with Héctor Palma, he gradually expanded his influence beyond Sinaloa, especially into the state of Nayarit. In this region, they established, in the mid-80s, a major receiving point for Colombian merchandise, using secret landing airstrips for planes and secluded coastal areas for small boats. All this logistics infrastructure operates efficiently thanks to the network of corrupt contacts that El Chapo carefully built within the Mexican military. This trio, El Chapo, Héctor, and a little later El Barbas, handled operational logistics, often under Amado's direction, who was much higher in the organization's hierarchy. These kingpins had a very simple goal: to move the product north toward the United States. Each leader had his own team of loyal people and teamed up with others when necessary. Let's take a concrete example. A shipment arrives on the coast of Nayarit. The first team receives it, stores it, and prepares it for transport north. To get it to the border, they call on other associates for a commission. Upon arrival in a border city like Ojinaga, Juarez, or Tijuana, a third group takes over. Their task? Storing the merchandise and breaking it into smaller batches to ease the border crossing. This group, having generally bribed local authorities, collects its own commission for these services and the protection it provides. Then, a fourth team handles transport to Los Angeles, where other warehouses await these smaller shipments. This stage also earns its share of commissions. In this system, nothing comes for free. A kilogram of white powder sold in the United States for $30,000 and bought for $2,000 doesn't yield $28,000 in net profit for the person sourcing it in Colombia. A significant portion of this margin disappears along the chain of intermediaries. Miguel's organization aimed to coordinate all these players to maximize the efficiency of this logistics chain. Yet, his power was not absolute. Even though he had built an unprecedented distribution network with the Colombians, he was not the only one with privileged connections. The Colombians, shrewd and pragmatic, had built a network of multiple partners in Mexico. They didn't put all their eggs in one basket. Confidential DEA documents reveal a surprising reality. No fewer than 62 leaders operated simultaneously along the border. It wasn't a unified empire, but a complex mosaic of small criminal networks that, depending on the circumstances, collaborated, ignored each other, or clashed. Miguel was certainly the most influential of all these barons, but he had to accept a bitter truth. Even the one nicknamed the Boss of Bosses could not monopolize the vast Mexican underworld. Regarding El Chapo, his status in the hierarchy was that of a mid-level operator, so insignificant that he didn't even show up in DEA reports. According to testimony from his former lieutenant nicknamed El Gordo, who became a protected witness, El Chapo's organization remained relatively modest in 1987, with just 25 to 27 people under his command.
I was a pilot, responsible for communicating with Colombian traffickers, receiving planes loaded with coke, storing the drugs, sending them to the United States, keeping the money, and making payments for transportation, distribution, and sale of drugs. I also paid the press and Mexican government officials. I worked solely and exclusively for Joaquín Guzmán Loera.
El Gordo was not an ordinary man. College-educated and holding a pilot's license, he nonetheless chose to put his skills at the service of El Chapo and his clandestine landing strips, lured by the exceptional pay. After several successful transport missions, an incident nearly ended his career. During a flight to Guadalajara with El Chapo and his bodyguard, they came close to disaster while attempting to land on a runway that was too short. Having barely escaped death, the bodyguard wanted to eliminate El Gordo for his error, but El Chapo stepped in. Instead of ending his career, El Chapo recognized his potential and promoted him to a strategic position in Mexico City, the epicenter of the country's police operations. Starting in March 1987, El Gordo became responsible for strategic relationships and administrative management of the organization. Later, he would testify that Calderoni was one of their main contacts in the police and that they got along well. During one of the trials, the prosecutor asks El Gordo the following question.
Did you personally give money to González Calderoni?
To which El Gordo answers,
A lot of money. 2 or 3 times, about $10 million.
Calderoni was not an ordinary police officer. Unlike his colleagues who accepted bribes to supplement their meager salaries, he was already wealthy before joining law enforcement. His motivation went beyond mere financial gain. He was drawn to challenges and spectacular seizures. Although notoriously corrupt, he carried out impressive operations when circumstances demanded it. One of these missions would soon make history in Mexico. As we explained, El Chapo's group and his partners like Héctor Palma and El Barbas were merely emerging figures who received only crumbs compared to the fortunes generated by Miguel and Amado, the latter becoming a highly respected senior associate. This trio consolidated their operations primarily in Sinaloa, while other players of similar stature, such as the Arellano Felix brothers led by Benjamin, expanded their activities in Tijuana under the supervision of other associates. The barons of Sinaloa and Tijuana shared common interests which facilitated their business collaboration. For example, when El Chapo's group needed to move their merchandise to the United States, they often used the Tijuana route, where the Arellano brothers organization would take over. These various factions jointly managed the cartel's daily operations. This system functioned efficiently as long as Miguel maintained the cohesion of this complex structure. Everything changed in 1989. Miguel, who seemed untouchable after infiltrating the country's highest political circles, saw himself more of a respectable businessman than Mexico's top kingpin. Yet he would have to give up his position. Who could stop a man so powerful? It was Calderón, who, under direct orders from the Mexican president, carried out the operation. Unlike what happened with Pablo Acosta, this time the orders were clear. Miguel must be captured alive.
I was planning to retire. It was early 1989. I had been with the police from 1983 to 1989 and wanted to step down. Then I was called to handle the Miguel Felix Gallardo case. Of course I knew who he was, the number one.
They asked if I could go catch Felix Gallardo. And I asked, do you really want to catch him? Or do you want to pretend like you're catching him? So they explained, no, President Salinas is very interested in having us catch Felix Gallardo. Why? Why now? Why not 3 years ago?
The year 1989 marks a decisive turning point, as Calderón himself explains. This period coincides with the certification process between the United States and Mexico.
When Carlos Salinas took over as president in 1988, it was supposed to be different. Elected with his economy in crisis, Salinas needed U.S. help. But first he had to prove to the U.S. Congress that Mexico was cooperating in the drug war, a process called certification.
This certification represented a crucial matter. If Mexico demonstrated full cooperation in the war on drugs, it would maintain U.S. international aid. However, failure would have meant the suspension of military aid, trade benefits, loans, and other economic advantages crucial for a country facing a severe debt crisis. In other words, a country that not only produces drugs but also serves as a major transit point for Colombian cartels must urgently restore its international image. As the certification evaluations approached, the Mexican government ramped up highly publicized anti-drug operations, often viewed by observers as mere window dressing. Meanwhile, Miguel, the undisputed Mexican godfather and one of the primary suspects in the Kiki Camarena case, was moving freely throughout Mexico. This situation sent a clear message to U.S. authorities. The Mexican government was either incompetent or complicit.
If certification occurred, then part of the debt would be forgiven. Mexico wants to have some leverage. With the capture of Felix Gallardo, Mexico will have leverage.
In April 1989, an operation was launched in Guadalajara. Miguel was apprehended in a villa by Calderón and his men without offering any resistance. Their long-standing relationship made the scene even more striking. Miguel, surprised, addressed Calderón familiarly. "What's going on, my friend?" Calderón responded coldly that he didn't know him. In a handwritten letter written years later from his cell, Miguel expressed his astonishment at the betrayal, recalling their first meeting in Guadalajara where Calderón had promised never to harm him or his family. Faced with a direct presidential order and intense U.S. pressure, Calderón had no choice but to carry out his mission. The operation itself was far from spectacular. Miguel was taken by surprise, believing he was under complete protection. Without realizing it, Miguel's empire was on the verge of collapse. Jesus Blancornelas, an intrepid journalist honored for his fight against the cartels, reported that Miguel organized a meeting from prison, bringing together the organization's main lieutenants to plan the division of his empire. According to the journalist, Miguel was a man with a genuine entrepreneurial spirit, preferring negotiation over conflict, but his arrest had become a political necessity. From his cell, Miguel summoned his associates to Acapulco, a popular Pacific Coast resort. The goal of the meeting was clear: to reach a peaceful consensus, free of rivalries or conflicts, by assigning each lieutenant an exclusive territory. This division involved the areas controlled by the Guadalajara organization, with each territory, called a plaza, allowing its holder to collect the associated profits and impose a tax on traffickers passing through their domain. The plazas were strategically allocated, primarily near the U.S. border where the merchandise passed through. El Chapo received Tecate. His friend Hector was given San Luis Rio Colorado, while Juarez was entrusted to Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, already an associate of Amado. As for Tijuana, the most profitable plaza in the network due to its strategic location on the California border, it was assigned to El Chuy, who subsequently delegated operational management to the Arellano Felix brothers led by Benjamin. According to Blanco Ornelas, if the lieutenants of the Guadalajara Cartel had strictly adhered to this division, the organization would have become the most powerful in the country.
If the instructions of the former Sinaloa boss had been followed, the most powerful cartel in the world would exist today. However, the absence of a single leader in the presence of multiple chiefs, each feeling superior to the others, led to disorganization and discord.
Meanwhile, in prison, Miguel offers a different version of events. In a letter written years later, he denies having distributed the plazas and identifies Calderoni as the true person responsible for the Acapulco meeting. According to him, the super cop's presence was primarily intended to maintain stability in the border regions and prevent an outbreak of violence that might have drawn the attention of U.S. authorities. The Acapulco Pact, if it ever existed, was ultimately just a brief truce before ambition, mistrust, and the thirst for power reasserted themselves, plunging Mexico into a spiral of violence that continues to this day. First, Miguel had underestimated the rise of his former subordinates. These men, who had worked for Miguel 10 years earlier, now wanted to be their own bosses. Figures such as the Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana, as well as El Chapo and Hector, sought greater autonomy, wealth, and influence. Each gradually built his own organization, capable of competing with the others. In the underworld, growth is exponential. El Chapo reached such a level of sophistication that he developed an extensive network of cross-border tunnels. Before he became known as El Chapo, he was called El Rápido, the fast one, in the underworld. Let's look at this in more detail. In May 1990, in Douglas, Arizona, a border town on the U.S. side, U.S. Customs agents received a tip about a suspicious warehouse. They set up a surveillance operation and spotted a truck that had just been loaded. They followed it for several hours until it reached another warehouse. After searching this second warehouse, the agents discovered nearly a ton of white powder. Following this seizure and the arrest of several suspects, the investigation led them back to the first warehouse in Douglas, beneath which they discovered a sophisticated 80-meter tunnel connecting to a luxurious residence across the border in Agua Prieta, Mexico. U.S. agents, accompanied by Mexican authorities, conducted a search of the luxurious house. In a room set up as a game room, an agent noticed that the concrete beneath the pool table was a different color from the rest of the floor, raising his suspicions of a possible tunnel entrance. Despite using a jackhammer, they were unable to break through the floor. It was only when an agent outside discovered a hydraulic valve and activated it that the floor beneath the pool table rose, revealing a sophisticated system comparable to a car lift in an automotive garage. Witnesses described the secret passage as something straight out of a James Bond movie. According to authorities' estimates, the construction of this tunnel would have cost more than $1.5 million, ultimately a modest investment considering the dozens of tons of coke that would have crossed it. It is remarkable that U.S. Customs agents did not discover the tunnel earlier, given the proximity between the building serving as a drug unloading point and the customs office, located just a few streets apart. This proximity raises questions about possible American corruption that would have allowed this operation to function for so long. According to available information, American authorities had suspected the existence of a tunnel in Arizona for several months. An informant had alerted customs officers that the Narcos had literally moved their operations underground. Once the warehouse was discovered in Douglas, on the Mexican side, the occupants of the luxurious house vanished just before law enforcement arrived. Someone within the authorities themselves had obviously warned them. Remember El Gordo, El Chapo's key lieutenant, who at the time almost got fired because he nearly crashed the plane a few years earlier? According to subsequent testimonies to American authorities, this underground passage in Agua Prieta represented much more than a simple route. It was a vital artery through which countless shipments of Colombian merchandise destined for the American market transited. El Gordo explains that he was at El Chapo's headquarters in Mexico City when the latter told him that Calderoni had just warned him. The Americans had discovered the tunnel and were preparing an operation with the Mexican police. Although the merchandise in Arizona was lost, El Chapo and his team rushed to the area to recover a shipment of 7 tons of coke stored in the luxurious house. They had planned to move it through the same tunnel and managed to recover it before the authorities intervened. This tunnel was just one part of the vast underground network created by El Chapo. His ability to quickly transport drugs to the United States earned him the trust of Colombian suppliers and the nickname El Rápido, further strengthening his advantage over his competitors. Let's return to the supposed meeting in Acapulco. This territorial division in the form of plazas, although designed to maintain peace, already contained the seeds of future conflicts. For years, certain influential members of the Guadalajara organization had developed their own distribution networks and infrastructure. Overnight, they were told they could no longer use them freely or would have to pay a tax to continue their operations. Frustration grew, particularly around Tijuana. This border city represented a strategic jewel through which the majority of white powder destined for the expanding California market transited. By assigning this territory to Benjamin's family, they found themselves with a veritable gold mine in their hands. This allocation immediately created tensions with the other factions. El Chapo, relegated to the small town of Tecate, could only observe the flagrant inequality of this distribution. Compared to the imposing metropolis of Tijuana, Tecate was like a simple village. The situation worsened when Benjamin and his family began acting like true lords of Tijuana, gradually building their own independent organization, which would become known as the Tijuana Cartel. Beyond territorial considerations, El Chapo harbored a personal grudge against this family, which had executed one of his close friends shortly before. For him, this man was like a brother, and even though he accepted a temporary truce, he waited patiently for the right moment to exact his revenge. Hector Palma also bore the scars of a family tragedy, which he partly blamed on the men from Tijuana. The obvious injustice fueled their resentment toward Miguel, who clearly favored the brothers from Tijuana, letting them operate without fear of any consequences. As long as Miguel remained free, he managed to maintain a semblance of order in this fragile hierarchy. But once imprisoned, the last barrier against chaos had fallen. El Chapo and his associate Hector established their fallback base in the Sinaloa area, where El Azul will join them later. Meanwhile, Amado allies himself with Rafael to consolidate operations in the Juarez corridor. With his fleet of planes and international contacts, Amado skillfully positions himself to take over the most lucrative operations abandoned by Miguel. But faced with the growing power of the Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana, El Chapo's group needed a heavyweight ally. This is where the man who had been lurking in the shadows from the beginning enters the scene, the one considered the true leader of the Sinaloa Cartel. A man who, for the next 35 years, would never set foot in prison. Some consider him the true strategist behind El Chapo, preferring to let the latter remain in the spotlight. Like a ghost, his discreet movements make it impossible to distinguish myth from reality. He is Ismael Zambada García, known as El Mayo, for whom Sinaloa serves as the undisputed headquarters. Despite a strong friendship with Benjamin of Tijuana, El Mayo would also suffer from the arrogance of this boss, who thought he could do whatever he wanted and imposed a ban on him passing through Tijuana. A lesson had to be taught to the brothers of Tijuana. Together, these four men, El Chapo, Hector Palma, El Azul, and El Mayo, formed the central core of what would later become the Sinaloa Cartel, which in 2025, according to DEA reports, despite various internal tensions, is recognized as one of the largest in the world, with a presence in nearly all of Mexico. As for Amado, being on good terms with everyone, he would choose to join the offensive alongside his friend El Mayo. During this period, collaboration between the groups was so close that distinction between members from Juarez and those from Sinaloa became blurred. Amado himself was often considered an integral part of the Sinaloa organization. Regardless of labels, the first real war for control of the territories begins.